Today, class, we'll be talking about the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War is one of several wars that was happening in the 16 and 1700s. The 7 Years' War is what in America is called the French and Indian War, because in America we fought specifically the French and the Indians. Around the world, the English and the French were fighting. The problem seems to have began because the French and the English were arguing over who owned what in what's today America and Canada. The French said they owned a little bit more of what's today America. The English said no, they owned a little bit more of what's today Canada. And it created this problem. Several weeks ago, when we talked about the colony ideas, I told you that the French colonists really got along with the Indians really well. And so the French and the Indians were good buddies. Well, the English didn't do so well with the Indians. The fighting really begins, though, when the French began building bases in what's today considered English America. The English and the Americans were not really happy about this concept. The first fighting of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, began in 1754 in the Ohio Valley. The British had a fort called Fort Necessity, and the French also had a fort. The two groups did not like their forts being so close to each other. The British fort, in what's one of the weird situations in history, the British fort was where a young George Washington was beginning his military career. George Washington was part of the British Army at the time, and he gets tasked with helping deal with this French fort situation. The English specifically were led by a guy named Edward Braddock. Edward Braddock's right-hand man, or second in command, was George Washington, an American. And Braddock was sent to drive the French out of the Ohio Valley. Well, the English did their fighting in a very classical style. Everybody marched in nice long columns and rows. You see this kind of in movies if you see The Patriot. The English are marching in their nice rows, and everybody would stop and take breaks and have their tea because the English just love tea. Well, the French and the Native Americans, they knew this was kind of stupid, and so they hid behind trees and they hid behind rocks and they laid down on the ground and things like that. And they attacked the bright colored English uniforms, which were a really bright red color. The British lost really bad, 1,000 people, including the commander, Braddock. On this page, I figured I would illustrate this concept. You look and you can see the English soldiers are wearing really nice, bright red and white uniforms, surrounded by green and brown trees and grass, dirt. The Indian, meanwhile, is obviously not wearing all that many clothes, but he's able to blend in much better. The English are there in their nice little rows, and the Indians are kind of poking out behind trees and things. The English lost the first battle really bad, which is why it's called Braddock's defeat. The English were not prepared for this kind of fighting. The Indian, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, is about to take their favorite victory sign. He's going to scalp the English guy. The French and the Indians began winning big. The fighting in America led to the start of a large war, almost a world war, between the English colonies and the French colonies around the world, called the 7 Years' War. The first years of the war went very badly for the Americans and for the English. The British weren't prepared for this type of fighting, but the French were. The French had hung out with the Indians for a while, and they had learned how to kind of live off the land and things. And so the French began capturing forts all around what's today parts of America, and Lake Ontario and Lake George. France's Native American allies, the Indians, began staging raids on frontier farms from New York down to West Virginia. They began killing the settlers. They would burn the farmhouses and the crops. They would chase the families back to the coast. It's going to create an ongoing problem as the Americans just decide that the Indians are these horrible savages that will kill you in your sleep. Even though, that's kind of what the Europeans had already been doing to the Indians also. The tide of the war finally began to change, though, when England's Parliament got a new Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the head guy in Parliament. They chose a man named William Pitt to be the British Prime Minister. And he vowed, no matter what, he would make England win this war. To do this, he set out doing three main things. Point number one, he began buying the colonists' support. The colonists were kind of almost at the point of giving up. And he bought their support by giving more and more money to America to help fight the war. Point number two, he began buying off the Native Americans, the Indians, the French allies, by telling them, hey, we'll kind of keep the colonists from taking any more of your land. I know they keep moving into Indian lands. We'll just tell them you can't do that anymore. With the main goal being he would expel the French from North America. These ideas that Pitt had led to the Americans kind of getting their groove back, and they were ready for the fight from this point on. Down south, the colonists and the British fought off the Cherokee, and they began capturing lots of French forts, cutting off the supply lines for the French. The British eventually captured the major French city in North America, Quebec, in 1759. By 1760, they conquered another major Canadian French city called Montreal. And in the final years of the war, the British were able to defeat the French Navy. A navy is those guys that fight in boats on the water, for those of you who don't know. And they took the French colonies in the Caribbean, the island colonies. At this point, the French Empire in North America comes to an end. England basically got all of what France owned in the Western Hemisphere. By the end of the war, the map of North America had changed drastically. The English got most of what's today Canada, the United States, all the way to the Mississippi River. The Spanish got the French lands west of the Mississippi River, almost all the way out, pretty much to the Rocky Mountains. The French were driven to the far west coast of North America, and they still controlled some of South America. You look at the Caribbean, all of it's now basically pink, and there's little green spots, which is Spanish. This was a major blow to the French, that they basically didn't recover from.